Kristen Welker asked the candidates directly about a reality that black families face, but one that is rarely discussed in national politics, the talk. It's a conversation black parents have to prepare their children to interact with police.
Mr. Vice President, in the next 2 minutes, I want you to speak directly to these families. Do you understand why these parents fear for their children?
I never had to tell my daughter, if she's pulled over, make sure she puts, for a traffic stop, put both hands on top of the wheel and don't reach for the glove box because someone may shoot you. But a black parent, no matter how wealthy or how poor they are, has to teach their child, when you're walking down the street, don't have a hoodie on when you go across the street.
Nobody has done more for the black community than Donald Trump. And if you look, with the exception of Abraham Lincoln, possible exception, but the exception of Abraham Lincoln, nobody has done what I've done.
Joining me now, Joel Payne, former senior aide for the Hillary Clinton 2016 campaign and the host of the podcast, Here Comes the Pain. Former Republican Congressman David Jolly, who is no longer affiliated with the Republican Party, and Victoria DeFrancesco Soto, Assistant Dean at the LBJ School of Public Affairs at the University of Texas. Welcome all. Well, Joel, what's your reaction to that? With the possible exception of Abraham Lincoln.
I thought it really was one of Kristen's best questions that she asked last night, and I think it revealed so much about both candidates. President Trump tends to talk very transactionally about all politics, particularly politics related to people from underrepresented communities. And he talks a lot about the things he's done for the black community, but what he hasn't done is extend dignity and humanity to so many African Americans who've seen how he's governed and how he's divided the country. And so to hear Joe Biden talk in very personal terms about how he understands that split reality for African Americans versus to hear President Trump list off accomplishments as if that is all of what political representation is. I thought that was very striking, and I think that demonstrates the type of moral leadership you'd get from each person. Joe Biden would lead with an understanding of that split reality for African Americans. President Trump would continue to lead by talking about transactions and not about respect.
And Victoria, the topic of immigration last night came up, thankfully, and we've discussed earlier the separation of children, which was, you know, an empathy gap, a profound empathy gap between the two candidates, but catch and release. He then went on to characterize the people who came back to the United States for their court dates this way.
When you say they come back, they don't come back, Joe. They never come back. Only the really, I hate to say this, but those with the lowest IQ, they might come back.
That was kind of a stunning moment. Victoria, how did that strike you?
Very profoundly in the way that President Trump continues to villainize the immigrant community, from being stupid and ignorant to rapists and criminals, right? But really the factual base to what's going on is completely missing. So what they're talking about here is that when somebody is apprehended in previous administrations, not only in the Obama administration, the Bush administration prior to that, you could be let out on bail. You could be let out to be with family members, and depending on the status of your situation, you may have an ankle monitor, or you just may be tracked with the family or loved ones that you're staying with. And the fact is that for many of these people who are eager to plead their case, who are eager to gain citizenship, they will come back. Not all of them, but a majority of them. And in addition to that, it is so important to also look at the fiscal note, because the Republican Party is also very conscientious of that. The apprehension of large scale that we're seeing right now in terms of immigration is incredibly costly. There are much smarter and effective ways to do that the research has clearly shown. So in trying to oversimplify this idea of immigrant detention and catch and release, it really misses the complexity of the broken immigration system we have before us.
And David Jolly, you knowing Florida so well, the president going to Florida today, going to the villages, senior citizens, such an important group. He was, again, very cavalier about the coronavirus last night, saying that there are some spikes, but not addressing the surge that we're now seeing in 39 states, and quote, saying they will soon be gone. As he heads to Florida, how is that a message for the people in the villages?
It's not an effective one, Andrea, and I think today or yesterday we had more cases than any day since July, suggesting coronavirus is as real as ever and as dangerous as ever. What I'm taken by in how Trump responded to the issue of coronavirus, his willingness to ignore the question over children separated from families, his willingness to just ignore the question about the talk and instead self-congratulate himself, is if you take the entire Trump narrative right now in contrast to Joe Biden, what is fascinating to me is that there is not a single part of Donald Trump's closing message that is trying to identify new voters. He's simply speaking to the same voters he's always had, and we know statistically that has never been more than 50% of the country. In contrast, Joe Biden is trying to pick up new voters in his closing message. The notion that he may be a Democratic presidential candidate, but he will be an American president to all people, a willingness to listen, to reach across the aisle. What Joe Biden is doing is expanding his coalition down the stretch, where Donald Trump is just sticking with what he knows, and it's a losing formula.
And another example, to Joel, was the way he talked. Well, he really didn't address the question in the climate change question about the racial disparities in the way poor people, brown and black people, people without assets are exposed to toxic waste and are look at Flint, Michigan, and have the most exposure to these poisons.
You bring up Flint, Michigan. Look at what happened 15 years ago in New Orleans with Katrina. Environmental justice is a real thing. I think it's smart for Joe Biden to be speaking about it in those terms. Obviously, you have to balance it off with economic interest and business interest. But I think Joe Biden is reflecting where not just Democrats, but a lot of Americans are starting to see the climate change discussion move into. So I think you can have a smart conversation about how to have an all of the above energy policy that includes fracking, but that it's also sensitive to the specific needs of different communities who have been under the bootstraps of really bad environmental policies that create injustices in their communities.
And he spoke as a child of the oil slicks on the windshield in the morning near Marcus Hook, Delaware. I know that area very well, and the cancer rates among people there. David, if you're a Republican, you're concerned about the risk to Republican senators. We've been seeing the tea leaves with John Cornyn, things that he has had to say. How does this debate come across? Is it reassuring to them that it was more of a normal debate?
No, it's not, because you have a president who continues to pursue a campaign of divisiveness and on the other side, one of inclusivity. And I think, the down ballot races are very informative right now, Andrea, because it is hard to see a world on November 3rd where Democrats pick up Arizona, Colorado, Maine, North Carolina, perhaps South Carolina, Montana, Alaska, and yet Donald Trump beats Joe Biden. The averages among those down ballot races suggest that Democrats are heading to a very good night on November 3rd.
Well, we're going to have to leave it there. 11 days to go. Joel Payne, Victoria DeFrancesco, Soto, David Jolly, thank you all so much. And poll position, where do things stand as the candidates head down the